Yeah, go for it.
Okay, episode 2. So we're gonna do it on wealth tax. Big topic right now. Not necessarily my biggest interest, although I'd say land value taxes, but we'll get into that later. So currently, the argument by the government and by my local MP after I contacted them was that we already have forms of wealth tax in inheritance tax, capital gains tax, and stamp duty.
Hmm.
So let's start with inheritance tax, right? Because that's also sort of been not in the news recently, but with like farmers and things like that.
Yeah.
So we've seen inheritance tax not only hit farmers, but it's also increased to 40%, I believe. And
Yeah.
see, that's sort of a wealth tax, but first of all, you have to wait for the person to die, right? So inherently, it's not necessarily a wealth tax because obviously that person can pass down said wealth before they die, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of people are and have, and in fact, because of that, because rich people or the wealthy have enough money to have accountants and lawyers and tax lawyers and things like that, they have inheritance tax is inherently a regressive tax, not only because it's flat, right? It's obviously it's not flat. Your primary residence doesn't get caught in wealth inheritance tax, but like in terms of the fact that wealthy people can have tax lawyers and pass it down onto people, right? It's regressive because they can avoid it very easily.
Yeah.
And sure, you can argue for loopholes, but I don't know. So what's your devil's advocate take for how inheritance tax is good enough as a wealth tax?
I would argue that it's not so much the tax's fault in terms of um, it's inefficient as a tax. I'd argue that we have too weak of a governance on it in terms of, like you said, side steps through trust insurances and stuff like that. Um, but I wouldn't say you need another tax or change the tax because, like you said, if you was able to enforce it onto the correct proportion of people you're trying to argue it for, then I'd say it would generate enough income in that retrospect.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not necessarily okay. So yeah, but what the issue is that it doesn't reduce wealth hoarding. Is my issue with it. And sure, capital gains tax does to an extent, to a very little extent, but we'll get into that. And stamp duty does also, but also that's regressive, and I'll get into that. So inheritance tax. Right? So I get what you're saying. The main issue with inheritance tax is that you can sidestep around it, but it's not good enough in and of itself as a wealth tax, I believe. It doesn't reduce wealth inequality. What it actually does is exacerbate generational inequality. Because obviously, okay, to an extent, right? So imagine you don't have inheritance tax, and now the wealth transfer from the old people to the young people when the old people die is actually better because what an inheritance tax does is obviously it's a death tax of sorts.
Yeah.
Because this is the thing, but an inheritance tax is levied on the person who dies, not on the person who receives, and I think that's my biggest gripe. Because because you levy it on the person who dies, it doesn't transfer well. It doesn't reduce the transfer of wealth from one person to another. So if you had, say, a 40% inheritance tax like we do now, but it's anything above, let's say, 10 grand, that incentivizes the person to spread the money around more evenly, which actually inherently incentivizes it to be spread across more people, which creates a greater generational wealth transfer in my eyes. That's the big issue of inheritance tax, is that it's levied on the person who dies and not on the person who receives. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but this is the other thing is that again, the ultimate issue with inheritance tax is yes, I can see the benefits to it. It stops like wealth hoarding past death, but it doesn't inherently stop wealth hoarding, and so that's what gets me into capital gains and stamp duty tax, right? So capital gains obviously can stop some level of wealth hoarding. Obviously, I mean, there's benefits and drawbacks, right? So if you have capital gains tax, you're not incentivized to sell because the moment you sell, you have to pay capital gains tax. So it actually does incentivize wealth hoarding to an extent, right? You buy up a stock, and the moment you sell the stock, you have to declare capital gains tax. So what you do is you just hold and hold and hold onto this stock Potentially even, you leave it in a trust fund for it to be inherited, and as we discussed, you can then step around inheritance tax and continue wealth continues to accumulate. Without you ever having to necessarily cash out and pay capital gains tax. So it does actually incentivize wealth accumulation. So it isn't a wealth tax. What it is it just makes the economy more illiquid and reduces money velocity, because money just gets stuck up in wealth, because you're never ever incentivized to cash it out. And I get that argument that, people. Okay, so for example, if a stock is failing, someone is going to want to sell that and then have to declare capital gains tax. And yeah, for sure, right? For sure. But a lot of the time, the biggest investments are generally in housing and bonds and things like that. And housing, as I'll get into, it has stamp duty tax. And so does stock to a small extent. There's 0.5% transaction tax on buying a stock. But, I mean, overall, right, capital gains tax is not a wealth tax. It's a tax on profits, which aren't necessarily productive profits, but they are certainly a barrier to reducing wealth. If you know what I mean.
Could you not argue based on that then? People who are getting larger profits, who have been holding for longer, then have to pay a higher percentage in capital gains, or would you rather a more progressive version of capital gains tax, where the more you make, you'd have a higher tax percentage on it?
I think, no, I think honestly a flat capital gains tax makes sense, because, okay, if you just think about it, capital gains is just on profits from stocks, basically, and bonds. So it's not productive. You're not actually doing anything for the economy. You're just shifting money around to different companies. You can make the argument that by investing in a company, that increases their stock value, which can therefore, they can then sell off some of their stocks and generate some capital for themselves. So to an extent, it is minorly productive because it generates capital for the company. But overall, you're not producing anything. You're literally just shifting money around the economy. So as I said, capital gains does reduce that, but how much benefit is that? Very, very little in my mind. So I think the way the Labour government has it right now, which is where capital gains is like 40%, maybe, I think honestly putting it at 45% so it matches the absolute top bracket makes more sense. But anyway, so it makes sense to have capital gains equal to income tax, certainly. I don't disagree with capital gains tax. I just disagree that it's a wealth tax and that the government is justifying it to not implement a wealth tax, if you know what I mean. Because it doesn't, as I said, it doesn't reduce wealth inequality. It just incentivizes holding. And as you said, yeah, sure, you could have a progressive system, but if you're so wealthy, you're never ever going to realistically need to pay capital gains tax, because you can just hoard these stocks and things like that.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough. What if the focus of the capital gains tax was shifted, and so, like in this case, you're talking about it's not productive enough to have capital gains tax on, let's say, blue chip stocks, very large blue chip stocks, but most of them aren't like locally effective, as in like they don't boost local economies. Like for example, I think you made a case in the last episode about was it Costco like decreased the economies of nearby areas because it was so ultra competitive.
I don't remember talking
what
about any competitive.
it might have been a different conversation,
Yeah,
but
I think we
anyway,
just had a conversation about it, but yeah, carry on.
the point being, what if you increase capital gains tax on like unproductive investments, so to speak, but then decreased it on more locally benefiting companies, because then is that not then a form of wealth tax?
So you mean like you would want capital gains tax on, say, like American companies, but companies registered on the FTSE, you wouldn't? You'd have a reduced capital gain. See, so yeah, but also, as I said, like, to what benefit is that to the wider economy? As I said, my main argument is that okay, so the only productive thing that comes out of investing in stocks, right, other than enriching yourself, right, is that it increases the stock value. So the company who owns said stock then can sell the stock and get more capital to then reinvest. But that not only, okay, so even that, right, even that small benefit has a drawback, because that company is now selling their stock. and that's reducing the ownership of their own company and giving it to shareholders, which are going to want more profits, which is actually going to then reduce the company's ability to invest because they're withholding, they're having to give away more percentage of their profit to shareholders, and on top of that, they're going to, we're going to run into the principal agent problem, where now you have shareholders demanding more and more and more and more, and the company, because they're getting less and less profit to reinvest, it becomes very difficult. So in fact, I would argue reducing capital gains tax to incentivize domestic buying to an extent is a hindrance, right? Because it actually does reduce investment. And you can make the case, right, that if we have a reduced capital gains tax, more money will flow into it, and the short-term gain will actually create long-term benefit, because let's say the company generates, from the sudden surge in the stock market from a capital gains tax reduction, which I don't think would actually happen, because I don't know. We saw capital gains tax increase, and we didn't see a massive decrease in the stock market.
Yeah.
So I'm not even the effectiveness of a reduction in capital gains taxes or an increase is questionable, right? All it does is just, again, as I said, incentivizes hoarding. So, but again, I'm not opposed to a capital gains tax. I'm more opposed to the way to wealth hoarding, and is wealth hoarding as a byproduct of capital gains. There's a very easy fix to this. It's called a wealth tax. It literally just forces people to not hoard wealth. But yeah, I mean, okay. Let's just say theoretically we increase capital gains tax to 100%. So now buying a stock is completely unprofitable. The only gain you get is dividends, right? Arguably, that's better than a capital gains tax. Arguably that's better than the current system, because people aren't incentivized to buy stocks that they think are going to do good in the future, and it reduces speculation, which obviously is a bad thing because it creates bubbles and things like this in the markets. So the point I'm making is capital gains tax as we have it right now, you either have it at 0% or 100% or not at all, really.
Okay.
Just from a purely economical, let's ignore that we have to balance the budget. You either put it at 0% to stop people from hoarding stocks, or you put it at 100% so people stop buying stocks as much for speculative purposes, and instead just buy it for, say, pension schemes that mostly do rely on dividends.
I was actually just going to bring up pension scheme. I would argue, if you targeted it more towards institutional buyers, would it not be more effective than affecting more so retail investors or companies that do what's it called, pension schemes? Because if, let's say, you put it up to 0, 100%, it would most affect them in terms of, like, let's say you wanted to decrease the amount of stocks being invested because it's so unproductive. Would that not affect people, like, for example?
Sorry, I just want to clarify. I don't mean to say to decrease investment into stocks. I more say to free up capital to invest elsewhere into more productive things. Carry on.
Well, can you hold on before I carry on, because this might change where I'm coming with this. What other things would you want to invest in?
Well, okay, so first of all, as I said, investing capital into stocks is very useless, and the issue we have with the current economy in the soft money system, right? Let's say we want. So obviously, I've advocated for hard money in the last episode, but let's just bring our mind to the modern economy with soft money. Consumption is at an all-time low, and what is that causing? And we have a very high marginal propensity to save, even amongst the very, very rich. Their propensity to consume is actually even lesser than the people at the very bottom of the ladder. So what's happening is we have a bunch of money stored up, and using Keynesian economics, right? If we stop people from buying up stock, and they're now, let's say they're consuming things with it, that's generating jobs, because people are going to have to fill the demand, let's say for just services, right? People are going to have to fill the demand for these services from the new consumption. So first of all, let's say a capital gains tax increases consumption. This is economic benefit. That's increasing money velocity, which is increasing GDP, because GDP is, of course, the way you calculate GDP is you calculate the amount of money in the economy and then times it by the money velocity. So right now we have a money velocity of 0.8. So the amount of money we have in the economy times that by 0.8, and that's our GDP. So we have a high capital gains tax. People are spending more money velocity. That's inherently going to boost GDP. So that's the interesting thing. Counterintuitively, increasing capital gains or having the threat of increasing capital gains tax, so people sell off stock and then spend it elsewhere, that's inherently going to boost the economy, which is interesting. We'll also get into that with land value tax. So first of all, yeah, I would assume, and I mean, I say I want, but I don't necessarily want any of these things. I don't really mind. I'm more of an advocate for land value tax, but it would first of all go to consumption because people are inherently going to want to consume things, and second of all, people could invest these things into, you know, their own companies, right? But ultra wealthy have a ridiculous amount of money, and like they just buy stocks with it. We could be investing this into more companies, letting people get access to low interest rate loans to start their own startups and things like that. And I mean, overall, right? Arguably, the money that's flowing into the economy will trickle down rather than going into stocks. From just them buying up. Let's say they buy up bonds, right? That reduces government debt burden, which can then increase. We can then increase public spending, and obviously that will trickle down in terms of the fact that public spending generally doesn't benefit the rich. Obviously, there's rare cases like the furlough scheme, where we basically just paid loads of people money, which immediately flowed upwards in the economy because people spent that. But for the most part, public spending, let's say all the money that flowed into the economy and then was taxed up by the government. Let's say that the bonds bought up, which reduces the debt burden. Now we have this extra money. We could spend it on, let's say, the NHS, and that benefits people, or education, and that benefits people in the long run.
Okay. 3 points onto that. Would you not say increase in consumerism so much cannot? Would you not argue can become inflationary? If let's say you took it out of stocks, or eventually it began meandering its way out of stocks because of capital gains tax, whatnot, would you not say that would then become inflationary because people are more consuming than they need to?
Okay, yes, but also no, because right. So so in this, I mean, logically, most stocks are owned by the top 10%, right? And these top 10% of people now they're going to spend. Let's say they spend the money on consumption. What? Like yes, there might be inflationary effects, but no, because I think about where they're going to spend that money, right? They're going to spend it on like luxury goods and luxury services, and these luxury goods and services are A, under demanded right now, and B, with a flow of money that's going to increase investment into these markets, which is going to boost employment and obviously boost the wider economy because there's new goods being created to supplement this demand. So in the short run, yeah, there might be inflation in these luxury service and luxury good businesses or markets, sorry, but that's going to make them more profitable and therefore going to cause investment, which is exactly what we want in the modern framework of the economy.
So then, excluding the 10%, would you not see a trickle down effect of inflation for middle class and high class investors, people who are often don't really need, well, no, they'll have massive pension funds, let's say they fund that money out of the pension funds because there's no true benefit now at this point to having loads of assets in terms of stocks. Would they not then buy up less? It would be proportionately less than ultra wealthy in terms of what luxury
But
goods they'd
pension
buy.
funds are exempt from capital gains tax.
Okay, my bad then.
Yeah.
However, point still stands.
That's just an inherent misunderstanding. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Point still stands. Would you not see an overall? I know long term it would be better in terms of, like you said, you'd eventually get more investment. However, short run, would it not create inflation for people who aren't in the middle to high, which would then be able to curb the inflated prices? Because you have to think it's not only going to be luxury items that would get inflated.
Okay, but where would so give me an example of a good that would be inflated.
What do you mean? What type of good are you on
Like
about?
how would so money is only inflated when in a certain market when that market has an increase in demand or a retraction in supply, right? That's basic economics. So
Yeah.
so let's use. I mean, okay. See, you're not giving me a good, so I'm just gonna have to make one up. Let's say it's food, right? These ultra rich people, or even the top 10%, which aren't necessarily ultra rich, but they predominantly own the stock market. Right now they have an incentive to go and consume. They're not going to go and buy more food, which is going to cause food inflation. They just aren't because they already have enough food. So like unless they're supplementing this new spending with buying Ozempic so they can eat more. I think for the most part, it's only gonna, as I said, it's only gonna cause inflationary effects in luxury goods and services, which are either you can make the argument they're over demanded because we need degrowth, but let's just use a Keynesian perspective. They're clearly under demanded because there's enough money to go into them, because there's enough well-off people to buy them, but people aren't because they're buying stocks instead, which, as I said, are unproductive, and therefore the gains of a higher capital gains tax would benefit this.
Okay, so this is just a theoretical position then. These ultra wealthy people, let's say, like you said, they're not going to be buying more common goods. Let's say they're buying fast cars, like just quite niche, but let's say they're buying Lamborghinis, Bugattis, everything that's expensive in terms of automobiles. Would the people they're buying off of these very expensive, well-known, very luxury car dealerships, would the average person working there not already be a higher earner? And so fleshing this thought out, the more investment they're getting, the more produce they're getting, more demand they're getting, is only benefiting those who are on average already more generating more income.
Well, the demand. Okay, so I mean, we're going back to the long run again, right? This demand is gonna. So people are demanding more of these cars. People are gonna have to be more. People are gonna have to be employed to build these cars. So that's gonna increase employment.
True, but what the point of that is, the people who are getting employed, the salespeople, the mechanics, all them, they're already at a higher income threshold. This doesn't average the average person working a co-op, is my point.
Well,
You're
okay.
not.
Well,
It wouldn't destabilize the. Go on.
okay. So, well, okay. I get your point. It's only benefiting the people employed, but the people employed have been paying into the tax system through income tax, which then is obviously then just redistributed to the wider economy. And I mean, even on top of that, right? Inherently, right? Where you're assuming the workers are just like pre-existing, and then suddenly we're getting a greater quantity of workers. No, what is happening is you have. So yeah, let's say you have 10 mechanics in the store, and then our demand doubles. Now you need 20 mechanics. You're going to have to train these 20 mechanics, which is going to obviously you're going to pay them through an apprenticeship, or you're going to pay for their education, which is already benefiting the economy because you have to pay people to train. But like you can see, there's like a multiplier effect, right? So like these people, more people are going to have to be employed in the sector who are going to benefit from the higher wages, and those people are going to have to come from somewhere, and the people who are already high earners aren't going to swap jobs into those. So what you're going to have is lower earners moving into the higher earning positions, which would increase the income of those people who initially had lower incomes, which would equalize the economy more.
Question that is that not assuming that you have a proportionate increase from demand to employers? Like I thought it was relatively
Yeah.
known
Okay.
that.
So yeah.
Right.
Obviously, that's assuming an increase in demand is an increase in employment is equal to that of the increase in demand, but the increase in employment is inherently going to happen no matter what, right?
Yeah, but my argument would be that it wouldn't be proportional enough. And so, sure, it would increase income tax for those who are then at high employed in these more luxury services. But for example, production factories of cars, for example, increasing demand would, well, let's say just build another factory and you can produce twice as much demand. That type of thing. The scale of it wouldn't increase enough employment to navigate the increase in demand, is my perspective on that.
Yeah, but it would okay. So we're just sort of getting into not necessarily a circle, but okay, like you're not strong. Okay, so like let's just look back at the point of capital gains tax is it reduces consumption in stocks. So what we're saying here is is you're saying, oh, it won't be equalizing enough, but inherently buying stocks is less equalizing than buying luxury cars which employ people to build them. You know? Like, obviously, both aren't entirely beneficial, and you could have more beneficial things, such as just taxing the excess wealth. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about capital gains tax here. And capital gains tax would increase consumption or savings elsewhere. And arguably, that's more equalizing than buying stocks. So why wouldn't you do that?
It's fair enough. Question.
Yeah.
Are we including commodities such as gold in this capital gains tax argument? Like, because one of the first thoughts I had would the stock market not flood to commodities and like such as gold or silver and so on and so forth, inflating the markets?
So, I mean, gold is capital gains. I mean, other than gold coins, gold is does fall under capital gains tax, so it would affect that. That would proportion. I mean, okay, so even then, like gold coins, right? Britannicas, there's a set supply of them because they're minted by I forget who, but they are minted by a certain company. So
Yeah.
Inherently, no, there's like a fixed supply, and gold is already massively overinflated anyway. So
Okay.
So the wealthy are already moving into buying gold either way. So like, I don't know. It's like a bit of a moot point.
Fair enough. Actually, this is kind of just like a sidetrack. Have you seen the how much China's buying increasing their gold reserves recently? I saw a chart on it earlier today while I was researching something.
I mean, they've always had large gold mines. So, but yeah, I think this is okay. We're getting sidetracked, but I think this is good to talk about. So obviously, there was all this hubbub about a BRICS unified currency. You know BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Yeah. So because it's so difficult to get these BRICS countries to agree to create a unified currency to fight the dollar, instead, from my perspective, they're buying up gold as this unified currency and then trading with each other with gold, which they are.
Oh wow.
So the accumulation of gold in China, and obviously India already had large gold reserves, but they're still accumulating it. And all of these, it's not necessarily they like gold. It's more that they're using gold as this unified currency. So we're almost going back to the 1800s with a gold standard, but instead it's sort of a loophole to have a unified currency pegged against the dollar. Because obviously you can exchange gold for dollars.
Yeah, I don't really see how that would negatively affect America because you could, like you said, you could just buy gold with dollars anyway. Would it not just decrease the demand, increase the price? Sorry.
Well, it decreases the demand for dollars, which offsets the dollar as the global reserve currency.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah. So okay, all right. Let's move on to the last existing quote unquote wealth tax. So stamp duty. Stamp duty affects. So there's a 0.5% stamp duty on stocks. There's a quote unquote progressive stamp duty on housing. Obviously, the more expensive your house, the higher stamp duty you pay. Although at this point, because houses are so expensive, pretty much everyone is paying a minimum of 2.5% stamp duty no matter what. And so this is a quote unquote a wealth tax because it's a tax. So if let's say you're a rich person and you own 10 houses and then you buy another house, you're going to get taxed on buying this house. But so is everyone else. It's regressive. You know, if you're a millionaire paying 2.5% stamp duty tax compared to the normal person also spending 2.5% on stamp duty tax, the millionaire is less affected than the average person.
Do you know what the rates are on stamp duty tax? It's not just flat,
I know 2.5% is the lowest. Hang on, let me check. Duty brackets.
Stamp up to 125, 0%, 250, 2%.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And that's for a single property, right? So inherently, like if it was stacked, right? If you're a rich person who owned 10,000 houses and you bought another one, it's not going to stack on top of that. That 10,000th house is still 2%. Although you do get a reduction in stamp duty tax if it's your first house, but it's still 5% on anything over, I believe, 300k, which is still ridiculous. Like we're very lucky in Lincolnshire that we do not have massively expensive housing, but you look at London, almost every single house is over 500k, very easily.
Yeah.
Or 300k even, and then 5% on top. So it's like, yeah. So overall, it's a regressive tax. It's not a wealth tax, and yes, it does limit landlord consumption. But okay, so you pay like stamp duty reserve tax once, and you pay off you pay off a house once, and then pretty much forever you're getting rent from renting out the house. And
Yeah.
there's an interesting chart: rent prices compared to 1980 in the private sector compared to public sector. So council estate rent has gone up. So private rent in relation to rent from say councils has gone up double that. Meanwhile, the supply of private rentals compared to the supply of public rentals has halved. So if you look at like the private rent market, it's quadrupled because obviously the supply has doubled and the price has doubled. Meanwhile, the council rents have halved and only gone up half of that in proportion to the private renting. So when people talk about renting as a choice, maybe when they were a child and they were 50, yeah, because public housing was more available and it was cheaper. Now it's more expensive and you're almost forced to do private renting because that's the most dominant rent market.
Mm.
So that's the other issue with stamp duty tax is that it's almost exacerbated the landlord. I say crisis. It's not particularly a crisis. The crisis is that housing's expensive and people can't get housing, but landlords aren't helping. And we'll get into land value tax. I might do a whole podcast just on land value tax, to be honest. But so anyway,
I mean, you definitely could.
Yeah.
So what is your exact argument, if you could sum it up?
On stamp duty. So my argument is that stamp duty is actually regressive because of A, the boundaries, and B, the fact that if you're an ultra wealthy person, you can just like pay off the tax very easily and still maintain the house, and you don't, and that's forever, right? Yeah, and okay. So this is less of a wealth argument, but this is my ultimate argument against stamp duty, is that it reduces the liquidity of the housing market because it's almost a tax on moving house.
Yeah, I was going to say, would that not just makes resistance to moving around large amounts?
Exactly, and that's the other thing, is that it obviously, because it's a tax on moving house, it makes people wanting to downscale way less likely, because having to downscale is more expensive because of a tax. And so therefore these old people with the more expensive housing are never going to downscale, and that's just going to keep driving up the housing prices.
True. If we didn't have stamp duty in place, would you say it's a good starting point for a let me rephrase. If, let's say, we didn't have a wealth tax, would you not argue a stamp duty tax would be a good starting place to then move it into a let's say land value tax on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, you could replace stamp duty tax with land value tax, and it would make the housing market more liquid, and it would also be more proportional, because a stamp duty tax has barriers on wealth, or like, so it's a barrier, it's like 300k then 500k or whatever, and then land value tax is just a flat percentage, and that flat percentage is in proportion to the value of your house. So that's it's almost a slider. So let's say you have a land value tax of 1% and you have a house of that's worth 100 grand. You're paying £1,000 in tax each year, and so then if you're suddenly and so unlike stamp duty reserve tax, if you're a pensioner who's in a £1 million house and you're having to pay 10 grand a year in stamp duty in land value tax, you're going to want to downscale. Whereas with stamp duty reserve tax, you have a £1 million house, you don't want to downscale because it's your primary residence, so it makes sense to hold on to it because it's not affected by inheritance tax, and it also makes sense not to sell it and downscale because you don't need to pay a continual tax. In fact, if anything, you're, as I said, disincentivized to move, because the moment you move, you have to pay a flat tax on buying a new house. So, it incentivizes hoarding, again, like capital gains tax. So all of these wealth taxes, in fact, are barriers to wealth and exacerbate wealth inequality because people are just holding on to assets in order to avoid the tax, which is exactly not what we want a wealth tax for. It's to reduce hoarding and speculation and things like that.
Question, just one of the things you said there, you said having a land value tax would incentivize like old pensioners, for example, to downsize. Would that not create more competition in lower valued housing, which would then raise the price, surely?
See, that's the thing. Okay, so when you're yes, but no, because when you move a house or when you move to a smaller house which is less valuable, you're selling that larger house, and if more pensioners are doing that on a scale, that's overall devaluing the housing market, isn't it? Because they're selling that house and someone has to buy that, and not anyone's going to buy that unless you're ultra wealthy, in which case you'd have to pay a higher tax in a theoretical land value tax system. You know, you're not going to buy that house. And even if you are ultra wealthy and you do buy that big house, you now have to pay. You have to pay a tax on it, and therefore the government can use that tax to fund new housing and things like that.
Okay.
So you're assuming almost a fixed supply, where they move to a smaller house and now everyone has to compete for smaller houses. No, because they're selling that big house, they have to sell it to someone. They'll sell that at a different market rate.
True, but even if they sell it at a low, let's say the house is worth 1 million. If they sell it for 700k, which is like, well, that's a 30% decrease in the actual price of the house. They can still downsize to a house that's worth 350k, let's say, and in the long term, they're still getting a net benefit, are they not?
Yeah, they're getting a net benefit, but what is the net negative to anyone else?
The fact they can now buy a cheaper house is what I mean by that. As in,
yeah, but they're selling that old house to someone.
Well, yeah, that's true.
And that someone is then benefiting because they have a house. Like, I just don't understand your argument here. Like, inherently, someone's getting a house.
Yeah. No, I didn't think it fully through. That's fine. Moving on.
All right, so let's just talk about a flat wealth tax. That's the big thing everyone's talking about. This is the meat and bones here. So Gary Stevenson and many people argue for a wealth tax of 2% on anything above £10 million.
Yeah.
But obviously, I mean, okay, so I have a gripe with it already, which is that like, this is not going to necessarily reduce housing, the housing crisis, because it will reduce that. Okay, hang on, how do I explain this? So it's okay. So I agree with a wealth tax, but a land value tax is just better. Basically, that's my gripe, and we'll get into land value tax later. But obviously, the thing about a wealth tax is it just inherently equalizes, because you're anything over 10 million. You don't really need anything over 10 million, so it's going to provide people with more money, theoretically, the public sector, and it's going to reduce obviously wealth hoarding, which is as we discussed, a big issue, and so therefore people are going to get. There's going to be a flow of money into the economy, into more productive things, other than hoarding stocks and assets and housing and things like this.
Is that the whole argument summed up?
Yeah. So basically, like, okay, I'll sum it up. A wealth tax reduces hoarding and incentivizes spending elsewhere onto more productive means. There you go.
Okay. First one, let's say your cut off is 10 million. Who would firstly, who's deciding the 10 million? Isn't that's kind of the beginning point of this?
Well, it's you just have that person's net worth.
You're deciding not of net worth, not liquid, or not.
Of course, it's a wealth tax. The wealth tax is not liquid. It's just overall their net worth. If you have a net worth of 11 million, and it's so that 1 million over 10 million will be taxed at 2%, so you'll be taxed 20k. In terms of just flat. So that's either on you to sell 20k worth of assets to pay in tax, or the government will seize 20k worth of assets.
Okay, is there anyone who's exempt from this?
Obviously not. It's 10 million. Like, why would you be exempt?
No, I mean like large farmers, like large farms, for example. Would they be exempt?
See, that's the thing. No one's ever clarified that. And Gary Stevens has never clarified that.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna say that's one of the main issues I'm because I can't, because I know I've heard the inheritance tax. I saw a lot. The main argument was about farmers and stuff.
Although the inheritance tax thing was anything over 1 million, 10 million is a lot bigger, right?
Yeah, because then you have things like Dyson Farms, but then they're also being productive. So would you really want to, take away their
Yeah,
land where
and
they're being
see, that's the
productive.
other thing I was getting to, is that a wealth tax it harms productivity in relation to land value tax, and that was my other big gripe with wealth tax. That sort of fell out my head, and you just racked my mind. A land value tax doesn't inhibit productivity, but a wealth tax does inhibit productivity.
Mm. I wonder if there probably is, but I wonder if you have a better answer than what I'm thinking of. Is there a level where wealth tax is like as productive as a land value tax up to a certain point?
Yeah, that's the other thing. Like, when it's okay, if you have an Elon Musk, right? I would argue yes, a wealth tax on him would absolutely be more productive than him spending 40 billion on Twitter and however much on XAI, which is like a glorified Reddit bot. Like
Yeah.
things like past us. I'd argue anything over $1 billion. Like, at what point? What benefit is that, right? And you can argue, oh, those people are only worth that much because they hold all these stocks. But the stocks could be held by the company, not by the individual. And then the individual could be the CEO of said company, which can then direct the company's decisions with the stocks. The individual does not need to own the stock for the company to function. If anything, it would be more beneficial for the individual to not own any stock and the company to own all the stock and the company to be directed by the CEO, because a lot of the time the CEO isn't just the richest guy, right? The CEO is the guy who knows the most about the company. Obviously, that's not always true, but that makes more sense than just the richest person owning the company, because the richest person doesn't necessarily know what he's doing. And I think Elon Musk is a very good example of that.
Yeah. Just a point here. If a wealth tax isn't uniformly distributed across major economies, would that not de-incentivize single countries to put in a wealth tax? Because let's say you have large corporations that work here, large net worth individuals that reside here who have generational wealth. Would they could they not just move, which would then destabilize the market?
Okay, so I'm so happy you made this point because I have a billion arguments against this. Okay, so first of all, what's the negative of that? What's the negative of really, really rich people leaving?
Would it not decrease, like you said, it's the equation for GDP? Would that not in some way or another affect the GDP of the economy?
Okay, so yeah, so now we're looking purely at GDP, but what are those people doing, right? Predominantly, they have a very high marginal propensity to save. We already discussed right now, they have a very low marginal propensity to consume, right? So why do we want them here? All they're doing is speculating on our assets and buying our assets and causing our assets to be unaffordable for the average person. If a wealthy person who predominantly owns, let's say, land and housing and things like this, which is very much true of the most wealthy people in this country. They also own stocks, but that's neither here nor there. We're more looking at the housing, right? If they own all this housing and all these stocks and everything, and then they leave, and they're getting taxed because those things are still in our country and we're taxing them, we can still seize them from them. And if they aren't willing to pay the tax and they sell it off, that's great because they've sold it off. The market's more liquid, so this housing can now be bought by the average person, and obviously that's reducing the price of housing. So, yeah, it might decrease the GDP, but the overall living standards will increase, won't they?
Well, yeah, the overall living standards would, but then you also have a decreased demand of luxury goods in that specific economy. Like as we were saying earlier, if you increase the demand, then you can increase employment in certain areas of the economy, which would therefore eventually shimmer the employment rate up.
Yeah, but
No?
okay, so now so people can buy houses. Housing is cheaper. So not only can people own a house, which is increasing their own wealth, so that is equalizing the economy. But also now that people own houses and they're paying less on rent because mortgages tend to be cheaper than rent overall. Obviously, right now we're living in unprecedented times because rent is in relation to mortgages surprisingly cheap just because of higher interest rates. But okay, so overall, right, owning a house is going to allow people to consume more, and individuals and people on lower incomes actually tend to consume more than people on higher incomes, obviously, because you get to at some point you're so wealthy you don't want to consume anymore and you're just going to buy shit. So, like, yeah, okay, so we have a small reduction in consumption from these rich people leaving, but now we have a massive boost in consumption from, the average person being able to have more disposable income, which they are more, like, inherently going to spend more of.
Okay, so I just I made the point that these more luxury brands would see a decreased demand. What would then happen if these luxury brands then relocated purely because you have to think the bigger the brand, the easier it is for
The
the
luxury
logistics to
brand,
change.
hang on, so sorry, the brand. What do you mean? We're taxing individuals' net worth here.
Yeah, yeah. But let's say these high net worth individuals leave, then what they would be a consumer for would then therefore see a decreased demand. And then because they see a decreased demand, they'd relocate into a different economy.
Can you give me any
And then
examples?
okay, well, any luxury car dealership, for example, who let's say everyone gets a house, everyone's then got an average higher living standard. True. However, you then have a changing economy, which is then
Okay,
less
again,
stable.
so sorry. Give me an example of a luxury car brand.
Okay. Lamborghini.
They operate out of Italy.
Yes, but then selling the cars in the UK, if no one's buying the cars in the
But
UK, they're
we
never going to ship
okay,
to the
okay.
UK.
So, but I think you just have a fundamental like misunderstanding of the economy. They operate in Italy. Their cars are made in Italy. If people in the UK are
Yeah,
buying them, they're importing them from Italy. That's a net negative to the UK economy because that's money flowing out of the UK economy and into Italy.
but there's more money circulating in the UK economy now.
That's taking money out of circulation because the money is going to Italy where that car is made.
I, I'm 90% sure that is proportionately lower than the amount that's being spent in the UK.
But your
Like,
argument was that less goods are going to be bought, but your example of a good was a good that isn't made in the UK and is in fact made overseas, which would inherently mean that like that's taking money out of the UK economy. So I mean it's good if that person leaves, right?
okay, let me find you an example.
Even like a domestic hire, like Jaguar, right, who are based out of the UK,
Yeah,
the majority of their sales are overseas, which is actually then another benefit to the UK. If we have a decrease in consumption domestically, but there's still obviously an overseas demand for Jaguars, right? Then we're exporting more Jaguars, which is therefore benefiting the economy more, which is because it's increasing our exports.
why would Jaguar be based in a country that would have a decreased demand in their product domestically? Would
Because
they
you
not
know how expensive it is to just pick up and leave. Like we have
would it not
Jaguar have all these factories in the UK. They have all their workers in the UK who they can't necessarily take with them unless they do, which again, there's a huge cost to that. Like as I said, the majority of consumption of these luxury car brands is overseas, right? Yes, there's a big demand domestically for Jaguars, but I mean even then, right? We're talking about people with a net worth of over 10 million. People with a net worth of 2 million are still buying Jaguars. People with a net worth of over 10 million probably have Jaguars for their fucking children for their 18th birthday. You know what I mean? Like, there's people. We're talking about a wealth tax here of over 10 million, and those people. There's such a small fraction of people that there's literally like very, very little hit to the demand of even domestically made luxury cars. Which, as I said, even if that is true, it would actually increase the proportion of exports, which would again benefit the UK economy because there's more money flowing into the UK economy.
okay? Let me give a different example then. I'll let you. I'll concede that point. Would you not? Would you not argue that increasing a wealth tax or having a wealth tax in the first case would make people want to move from the UK where they can be more entrepreneurial and have a higher net worth past 10 million without being restricted for it,
Okay, but
which would make the UK less competitive because other countries, other economies would have a more competitive entrepreneurial type
this is
economy.
then going back to my argument. It's a wealth tax on an individual, right?
Yeah,
So this entrepreneurial aspect. If you're an entrepreneur,
and you found a business, it's most likely going to be a private business. If it's scaling up past 10 million, at that point you're going to register it as an independent, or not an independent, as a private or a public company, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you have a company valued over 10 million pounds, and you're still running it as a sole trader or as a self-employed business, what the fuck are you doing? Yeah, that's just not rational.
I think you kind of missed the point. I can't lie. The point being the motivation for starting a business in terms of having like, for example, there'll be thousands, hundreds, thousands of people that want hundreds of millions of pounds, but then obviously less than that amount of people are going to eventually have that. Would it not incentivize them to want to be in a country that would allow them without restrictions to get to where they want?
I think you have a mission. Okay, so even if you're an entrepreneur and you want hundreds of millions of pounds, like
I don't know. I think people are therefore being an entrepreneur for the wrong reasons, right? You look at most successful entrepreneurs, and they're providing a service or a good that is a gap in the market, and so therefore they aren't necessarily led by greed; they're led by innovation, and the majority of the value generated by that company, right? They could hold that in the company's own stocks. They don't necessarily have to own the company stocks. The company can own their own stocks. And then they can be the CEO of this company that directs the company's decisions to do with those stocks, right? Okay, let's use Gymshark as an example. Like the CEO of Gymshark is worth 2-3 billion or something like that. But I think he's even in Patriotic Millionaire. I might be misdiagnosed, but I definitely know that he isn't opposed to a wealth tax. I remember seeing something along those lines, and he's very generous with the way he became a billionaire. So even in the example of these entrepreneurs wanting to be vastly rich, most entrepreneurs who want to be vastly rich aren't going to be successful. And if they are, they're inherently not going to pay much tax anyway, because the majority of them are offshoring on the Cayman Islands. So
okay.
But okay, also even then, like, I get your entrepreneur argument, but but again, it's so even in this entrepreneur argument, we're having a wealth tax of 2% above 10 million. Like, that is very, very, very little. This isn't like what I was talking about with a wealth accumulation surcharge, where let's say we have a wealth accumulation surcharge of 100 million, right? So anything over 100 million, you're not allowed that anymore. That just goes straight to the government, right? That would disincentivize wealth creation. But if you're an entrepreneur and you're getting taxed 2% on anything above 10 million, and you aren't there, that's inherently, and that's degrading your wealth. That inherently means that you're not getting more than a 2% return yearly, which, you're running a very, very bad business if that is not the truth. So therefore, you're not a good entrepreneur. It's the only businesses or markets where you'd really only get a 2% return is maybe housing. Even then, not necessarily. Housing goes up more than 2% a year recently. But let's say that the generally housing goes up to 2 or so percent a year. So the only markets that get hit by it tend to be asset markets, which tend to only go up a couple percentage a year, which is exactly what we're trying to counteract. We're trying to counteract asset hoarding.
So, but as I said, it's not as a wealth tax does inhibit productivity. I get what you're saying, especially with the entrepreneurial argument. I don't think it's necessarily true, but I think there's some merit to the fact that wealth tax does inhibit productivity, and that's why a land value tax is better.
Okay, would you like to, from this, pivot to a land value tax? It seems like you've wanted to talk about it all.
Well, we're getting to 54 minutes, and I wanna really go deep on land value tax, so I might leave that to the next episode, low key.
No worries. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up then?
I think we covered everything. I mean, we spoke about wealth accumulation surcharge briefly, and I mean, honestly, I agree. It's a completely idiotic idea, especially as the economy grows. Obviously, that's going to degrade people's wealth. So yeah. Financial transaction tax on stock/bonds that already exists, but at 0.5%. And honestly, I think, I'm just gonna bang these next two out: the FTT and gift tax. So financial transaction on stocks and things like that, a tax on that. Honestly, I think that's very idiotic because again, all that does is inherently make people want to accumulate and hoard wealth by not selling stock/bonds. And then a tax on cumulative gifts received. First of all, that's never going to happen because politicians really like getting gifts.
Yeah.
But even if it does happen, then that would have to be levied on inheritance tax and things like that. I imagine at the end of I'll just quickly explain it. So a gift tax is, so let's say you're given £1 million as a gift, right? And let's say we charge a 5% gift tax. And then let's say you're given in another 5 years, you're given another £1 million. So over time, so then you'd pay 5% on that 1 million, 5% on that other million. So you'd pay like what 100k total of that 2 million you were given in gifts. And then at the end of your life, you'd pay that tax on all the gifts you were given. So first of all, that's very hard to levy because you'd have to not only keep track of all the gifts that person is given, and yes, you can argue it closes loopholes for inheritance taxes, but at the same time, like it arguably it exacerbates the generational wealth gap again, because you're like the gifts arguably are a good thing because before you're dead, you're transferring wealth to a younger person, which is something we need with the generational wealth gap. So yeah. So then the last wealth tax I had on my list was land value tax, which we'll cover next episode. So yeah. You want to add anything? Or do you have any devil's advocate arguments what I just said?
Not specifically about them. However, I noted two things down. Past wealth taxes, such as I think there was one in France and one in Denmark, I think I wrote down. Both of them overturned or reformed their wealth taxes because the revenue.
So in France, they changed it to a mansion tax. Yes.
Yeah.
Norway, for example, they've maintained a wealth tax, and Spain, they've also maintained a wealth tax. So.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
Although
I'm not sure about Denmark, but Denmark, for example, has a land value tax which is rather high. So.
Yeah, actually, it's annoying that we're saving the land value tax for the next one because it seems such an easy pivotal point. But yeah, I think that's pretty much everything I have to say, except for one actually. With wealth tax, could it not become a massive valuation issue, as in terms of like corruption, in the way as such as like because it's based on inventory, not income, would it not be easy for people to falsify what things are worth to get under the bracket, which would become more of an issue?
So yeah, there's the issue of devaluing, obviously. And that's a hard issue. But so excluding like housing, stocks and gold and other assets are very easy to evaluate because you just take the market price. And then let's get to housing and land. That's also fairly easy. You would just look at so if it's like a huge mansion, then that's difficult to evaluate. Although as we discussed, they did that in France. They replaced their wealth tax with a mansion tax. So even in that case, yeah. But then like let's say land, you can look at local land prices and use that to compare. And if it's like housing in an urban area, you can look at local house pricing and then use that to compare. So you would need an increase in HMRC capabilities. You would need like a valuation team at the government, and you would need probably hundreds of people to man this team. But overall, the net benefits would obviously, you'd have better wealth equality. You'd raise tax revenue. So yes.
Question though, with that, like you just explained, I think that's one of the main issues I was going to come to. Would increasing the manpower of the HMRC and so on and so forth, where would the funds from that come from? If not, where would you have to take funds from to renegotiate
the wealth tax would fund it. So
that's once it's instilled, though. The process of actually getting it working would be a massive issue, would it not? In terms of
Okay, so you'd have to
actually
take.
funding
Okay,
it.
so even like let's just use modern monetary theory then. The government could just print money and then hire people to do it. And even if the government didn't operate under modern monetary theory and they did have the artificial barriers, which for some reason they stick to, right? Let's say they just took out a loan and then used that to pay for it. And then obviously they could pay off that loan with the wealth tax. So,
Yeah, okay. I like that workaround. Fair enough.
yep.
Right. I would just say we're about sorted now.
Yep. So we'll talk about land value tax next episode.
Yep, no worries.
end it
So
here.
what's the theme of that going to be? Just land value tax, and for and against.
Yeah. And I'll talk about Henry George because he's the goat.
Henry George. Right, I'll write that down.